She was pregnant when her husband kicked her out of the house, leaving her without money or a roof over her head. A month later, something shocking happened. Subscribe and write in the comments what city you're from. The morning sunlight slipped through the pale curtains, casting golden patterns on the polished wooden floor of the living room. Everything was in its place. The bookshelf dusted, the cushions aligned perfectly on the cream-colored sofa, and the gentle aroma of vanilla-scented candles lingering in the air. A small ceramic angel sat by the fireplace, its wings open as if embracing the stillness. In the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator blended with the ticking of the wall clock, creating a quiet rhythm that seemed to beat in time with the heart of the home. For anyone standing at the threshold, it would appear to be the portrait of peace, the very image of domestic harmony. And for most of her life, Malin believed it too. She had always been a woman who cherished the little things. The way the sunlight warmed her arms as she washed dishes, the comfort of familiar routines, the whisper of leaves outside the bedroom window at night. Malin found beauty in order, and love in the everyday rituals she shared with her husband, Jason. They had met 8 years ago at a city conference for nonprofit volunteers. He was charming and confident, with a laugh that made people want to draw closer. She was soft-spoken and kind, with eyes that held more depth than she let on. Their connection had been immediate and surprisingly effortless, as if something in the universe had quietly placed them side by side. Jason proposed after a year. They married under an old oak tree in a modest ceremony surrounded by family and friends. Malin remembered how his fingers trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her hand, how he whispered, "We've got this," just before their first kiss as husband and wife. It was the beginning of something sacred, or so she had thought. The first few years of marriage were filled with tender discoveries and shared dreams. They bought the little house together after months of saving. It wasn't large or grand, but it had character. Wooden floors that creaked in the hallway, a narrow staircase with a banister Jason had refinished himself, and a garden in the back where Malin planted tulips every spring. They painted the nursery a pale sky blue, even though there was no child yet, just hope. Children had always been a part of the plan. It was something they talked about often. Curly-haired toddlers running through the backyard, family dinners with messy plates and soft lullabies echoing through the house. But the months passed, and then years. Pregnancy tests turned negative over and over again. Malin bore the silent ache with grace, even when it hollowed her from the inside. Jason, for a time, stood by her. He would squeeze her hand in the doctor's office and make jokes to lighten the sterile air. They tried everything: diet changes, hormone treatments, even a round of IVF that left Malin bruised and exhausted. Still, nothing. It was during one of those endless gray afternoons when hope had begun to feel like a distant memory that the test finally came back positive. Malin had stared at the 2 lines for what felt like hours, her breath trapped in her chest. She didn't scream or jump or cry. She simply sat on the edge of the tub, holding that small piece of plastic as if it were a sacred relic, her hands trembling. Later that evening, when Jason returned from work, she handed him the test wordlessly. For a brief moment, there was light in his eyes, a flash of something like joy. He lifted her into his arms, laughed a little too loudly, and told her they were finally getting their miracle. In the days that followed, Malin floated through life as if wrapped in sunlight. She imagined tiny shoes, lullabies, the weight of a newborn on her chest. She began knitting again, her fingers clumsy at first but gaining confidence as she worked through patterns of tiny hats and socks. Jason was attentive, perhaps not as engaged as she hoped, but still there. He made her tea in the mornings, asked about her doctor's appointments, rested his hand on her growing belly when they watched television. There were moments, fleeting but real, when she believed they had found their way back to each other. But then the shadows began to slip in, quiet and gradual. Jason started coming home later. He spent more time in his car before entering the house, scrolling through his phone with a distracted look. He stopped asking about the baby's progress and began canceling plans with vague excuses. Malin tried not to see it. She convinced herself he was just tired, overwhelmed, adjusting. She remembered one night, sitting at the dinner table with a bowl of lukewarm stew, waiting for him long past the hour he said he'd be home. His chair sat empty, and the silence around her felt like a verdict. Still, she held on to the belief that things would settle, that once the baby arrived, he would fall in love all over again, with the child, with her, with the family they had once dreamed of. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky outside was overcast, the kind of dull gray that seeped into the bones. Malin had just come back from her prenatal appointment and was sitting in the living room, one hand resting on her belly, the other cradling a cup of chamomile tea. Jason walked in without his usual greeting, dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl near the door, and stood silently for a moment. She looked up at him with a soft smile. "How was work?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to the window, staring out as if he were someplace else entirely. Then, without turning around, he said, "I can't do this anymore." Malin blinked. "What do you mean?" His voice was low, almost too calm. "This, us, the baby, all of it. It's not what I want." The words did not register at first. She sat frozen, the warmth draining from her hands. "I thought I could be that person," he continued, "the husband, the father, the one who sticks around. But I'm not. I've tried, but I feel like I'm suffocating. This house, this life, it's not mine." She stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her heart roaring in her chest like a drum. "You said—" "I know what I said." He turned to her then, his face taut. "But I didn't mean it. Not really. I thought I did, but I was wrong." Malin could hardly breathe. "And the baby?" He looked away. "You'll figure it out. You always do." The silence between them was deafening. Then he added, "I need you to leave. The house is in my name. I'll give you a few days to pack." For a moment, time stopped. Malin's vision blurred. Her mind couldn't comprehend the cruelty. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the absolute coldness, the erasure of everything they had built. She wanted to scream, to cry, to shake him, but nothing came out. Her body felt leaden. Her child kicked softly inside her, as if in protest. Later, she stood on the front porch, 2 duffel bags at her feet, the late afternoon wind tugging at her coat. Jason had already gone. No explanation, no apologies. Just an empty driveway and the echo of a slammed door. Malin glanced back at the house, the place where she had imagined her child taking first steps, where love had once bloomed like a slow-growing vine. Now it stood as a hollow shell, silent and still. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and looked down the street. Her feet didn't know where to go, but they moved anyway. With every step, her world unraveled a little more. The illusion was gone. And now, all that remained was survival. The sidewalk was cracked in places, weeds sprouting through the seams, as if the ground itself had begun to break under the weight of its own stillness. Malin walked slowly, the duffel bags heavy in her aching arms, each step a battle between gravity and the part of her that still clung to dignity. The street was mostly empty. Cars passed her in distant lanes, drivers oblivious to the storm inside the quiet, dark-eyed woman trudging along the curb. The overcast sky stretched endlessly above her, dull and gray, offering no comfort, no shelter. The air was cold against her skin, and with every passing minute she could feel her strength waning. She had not thought this far ahead. When Jason told her to leave, something inside her had shattered, not loudly, but silently, like a window pane cracking inward without ever falling from its frame. She hadn't asked him where to go. She hadn't pleaded or screamed. Pride, perhaps, or simple disbelief had bound her tongue. Instead, she'd packed the bare essentials: clothes, prenatal vitamins, her worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit, and a small wooden box filled with ultrasound pictures and the beginnings of dreams that now felt childish. There had been no time to mourn, only time to move. Now, the reality pressed on her from all sides. She was a woman 6 months pregnant, alone, without a home, without a plan. The baby kicked softly beneath her coat, as if reminding her of the fragile life within. She looked down, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though there was no one to hear it but the wind. Malin reached a public library a few blocks from where Jason had dropped her off. The building was old, its bricks dark with age, and its windows clouded from years of condensation and wear. She stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. The air smelled of dust and forgotten stories. The woman at the front desk gave her a curt nod, glancing at her belly but saying nothing. Malin settled in a corner chair, setting her bags beside her, and pulled out her phone. The battery blinked red. 9%. No charger, no plan, no hope. She scrolled through her contacts, each name like a closed door. She hesitated over her sister's number, then moved past it. They hadn't spoken in 2 years, not since the fight about Jason. Her former co-workers? Too distant? Old friends from college? They had families of their own. She sent a hesitant text to her friend Helena. "Hey, I'm in a bit of a situation. Can I call?" After 10 minutes of silence, the red receipt appeared, then nothing. The library began to dim as evening came on. Lights flickered above, and, one by one, patrons trickled out. Malin stood up slowly, her legs stiff, her back aching. The librarian announced the closing in a tired voice. Malin nodded and stepped back outside. The cold slapped her harder this time. Darkness had settled over the city, the streetlights glowing like tired sentinels. She walked again, this time with less purpose, scanning the streets for anything that resembled refuge. At a gas station, she asked the clerk if he knew of a shelter. He pointed vaguely north and handed her a paper napkin with an address scribbled in pen. It took her an hour to find the place, her feet blistering, her body screaming in quiet agony. When she arrived, the shelter was nearly full. The woman behind the front desk eyed her suspiciously, took her name, and told her she'd be placed in a temporary bed if one was still available. No warmth, no welcome, just formality. The intake process was slow. Malin sat in a plastic chair, fluorescent lights buzzing above her. Other women filled the room, some with children clinging to their coats, others with vacant expressions and hollowed eyes. There were tears, quiet coughs, the rustling of paper bags, and the sound of exhausted bodies shifting in metal-framed chairs. One woman sat in the corner singing softly to herself, rocking back and forth. It felt like another world entirely, one that Malin had never imagined herself entering. When her name was finally called, she followed a volunteer down a dim hallway with stained walls and faded signs. They brought her to a room with 4 beds, each barely large enough for a grown adult. Only one was unoccupied. Malin placed her bags down quietly and sat on the edge of the mattress, which creaked under her weight. Across from her lay an older woman with tight gray curls and a piercing gaze. She didn't speak, only watched Malin with the weary, measuring look of someone who had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. The silence in the room was thick. Malin didn't try to speak. She pulled her coat tighter around her belly and leaned against the wall. The pain in her back pulsed. Her ankles were swollen, her throat dry. She hadn't eaten since the morning. She didn't even know what time it was anymore. All she knew was that she was somewhere she had never thought she'd be, surrounded by strangers, carrying a life inside her that deserved so much more than this. That night, she couldn't sleep. The mattress was thin, the air stuffy. Someone down the hall was crying, deep, wrenching sobs that echoed through the walls. Another voice snapped back in annoyance. There were footsteps, doors opening and closing, the rattle of keys. Her hand stayed on her belly, feeling every movement of her child as if anchoring herself to something real. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the sound of Jason's laughter, the way he had looked at her the first time she told him she loved him. But the memories felt like dreams now, worn at the edges, fading. The next morning arrived without grace. The overhead lights buzzed to life at 6 a.m. sharp. Volunteers knocked loudly, telling the women to be up and dressed. Malin rose slowly, her bones heavy with exhaustion. She brushed her teeth with a disposable brush, splashed cold water on her face in the communal bathroom, and returned to the room just as the gray-haired woman was buttoning up her coat. "You pregnant?" the woman asked flatly, without looking at her. Malin nodded. The woman snorted. "Figures." She said nothing more, just grabbed a worn canvas bag and walked out. Malin didn't follow. She sat on her bed and let her hands fall to her lap. It was only her second day without Jason, and already she felt like a century had passed. Later that afternoon, she was called in to speak with a social worker. The woman was young, maybe in her early 30s, with clipped speech and tired eyes behind square glasses. She asked Malin for her background, medical history, next of kin. Malin answered each question quietly, feeling as though she were unraveling with every word. The social worker handed her a pamphlet about government assistance programs, housing wait lists, and temporary job resources. It was all too much. Words blurred on the page. All Malin could think about was the tiny heartbeat she'd heard on the monitor 2 weeks ago, steady and strong. She had promised herself that this child would be safe. But how could she keep that promise now? That evening, as Malin returned to her shared room, the gray-haired woman, now sitting on the edge of her bed polishing her shoes with a paper towel, spoke without looking up. "You'll want to keep your food in your bag. People take things. And don't leave your shoes by the door. They'll walk off." Malin paused. "Thank you." The woman grunted. "Don't thank me. Just stay smart." Malin sat in silence for a moment before whispering, "I'm Malin." The woman finally looked at her. "Name's Gladys," she said. Her eyes softened, just a fraction. "You're too quiet. That's going to be a problem in here." "I'm not used to this," Malin admitted. "No one is," Gladys replied, "till they are." They didn't speak much more that night, but as Malin lay on her creaking bed listening to the shuffle of footsteps and the distant hum of the city outside the grimy window, she felt a strange comfort in Gladys's presence. It wasn't kindness, not exactly, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was something in between, something real. The next few days passed in a haze of repetition. Wake, dress, eat if there was food, try to find a job posting that didn't require hours of standing or heavy lifting, sleep among strangers. Repeat. Malin tried calling Helena again. No answer. She left a voicemail she instantly regretted and then turned her phone off to conserve what little battery remained. Gladys, despite her gruffness, seemed to be watching over her. She reminded Malin to take her vitamins, pointed out which showers had the best water pressure, and even gave her half a peanut butter sandwich one night when dinner ran out too soon. "You're carrying more than just yourself," she muttered by way of explanation. Malin was surprised by how grateful she felt. Not just for the sandwich, but for the companionship, however prickly. For the first time since Jason had sent her away, she didn't feel entirely invisible. Then, one night, as they lay in the darkened room, Malin whispered into the silence, "I don't know what to do." Gladys didn't respond right away. Then, in the darkness, she said, "My niece works at a radio station. She runs one of those human interest shows. You tell your story there, people might listen, might even help." "I don't want pity," Malin said softly. "It ain't pity," Gladys replied. "It's a lifeline." Malin turned the idea over in her mind. Speak on the radio? Share her private pain with strangers? The thought made her stomach twist, but so did the thought of staying here, of bringing a child into this uncertainty. In the darkness, her baby shifted, and she placed her hand gently over the spot. Maybe, just maybe, someone out there would listen. And maybe that would be enough. The days that followed moved slowly, each one folding into the next like pages of a book she didn't want to finish reading. The shelter had a rhythm of its own, a dull, steady beat built around early mornings, meals served on time if not exactly warm, the shuffle of tired feet in shared hallways, and the low murmur of lives paused, rerouted, and reimagined within cinder block walls. Malin found herself becoming part of that rhythm without even realizing it, carried forward not by purpose, but by necessity. Every morning, the lights blinked on at 6, humming faintly above them as if impatient to bring everyone back into motion. Volunteers made their rounds, knocking on doors and announcing breakfast with voices that tried to sound cheerful, though most often failed. Malin would sit up in bed slowly, her back stiff, her limbs heavy. Her pregnancy had begun to announce itself more boldly now, her belly stretched taut beneath every shirt, her feet swelling by midday, and exhaustion pooling in her bones no matter how much she rested. The baby moved often, sometimes gently, other times with enough force to make her pause mid-step. Each kick reminded her of time passing, of a future inching closer whether she was ready or not. Gladys, in her own way, had become a constant. She never offered affection, but she didn't need to. Her presence was enough, a lighthouse in the fog of Malin's new reality. Every day, Gladys polished her shoes and retied the same navy scarf around her neck with a precision that suggested old habits from another life. She never spoke of her past unless prompted, and even then her answers were spare. What Malin did know came in fragments. A daughter she hadn't seen in over a decade, a job she lost long ago, and a deep, abiding skepticism of promises. "You keep your expectations low, you won't be disappointed," Gladys said one morning, offering Malin the first half of her coffee from a chipped thermos. "That's the secret." Malin took a sip, the bitterness stinging her tongue, and managed a faint smile. What happens if something good actually comes? Gladys raised an eyebrow. "Then you be real quiet about it and hold on with both hands. Their conversations were short, sometimes no more than a sentence or two, but they began to carry weight. In a place where so many people were ghosts moving through routines, Gladys saw her. And, after everything that had happened, Malin didn't realize how much she had needed that. One evening, after dinner, canned soup, a roll of bread, and a bruised apple, Malin sat in the common room watching the news play on an old TV mounted high in the corner. The volume was low, subtitles trailing beneath the anchor's mouth. A story about rising rent prices scrolled across the screen. Someone in the back scoffed. "Tell me something I don't know," a voice muttered. Gladys sat beside her, knitting something in mismatched yarn, orange and purple stripes that didn't quite go together. She didn't look up from her work when she said, "You should talk to my niece." Malin turned. "The one who works at the radio station?" Gladys nodded. "I told her about you, just a little. She's interested." Malin blinked, uncertain. "What did you tell her?" "That you got a story," Gladys replied, not pausing her knitting. "That it's worth hearing." Malin felt her stomach tighten, not just from the baby pressing upward, but from something else. Fear, exposure, the idea of her voice reaching strangers, her pain echoing through speakers across the city, it made her breath shallow. "I don't know if I can," she said quietly. "It feels selfish, like asking for attention." Gladys finally looked up. "There's asking for attention, and there's asking for help. The difference is who you're asking and why." She paused. "People can't care if they don't know. That ain't your fault." The next day, after a restless night and a long walk around the shelter courtyard, Malin agreed to meet the niece. Her name was Lauren. She arrived that afternoon, dressed in jeans and a soft gray coat, with her curly hair pulled into a bun and a messenger bag slung across her chest. Her smile was kind, but not patronizing. She extended her hand to Malin as though meeting a colleague, not a case. "I'm really glad you're willing to talk," she said. "I've done a lot of segments on local housing issues, but hearing a real voice makes it matter. If you're ready, we can do a short pre-interview. Just to talk. No pressure." They found a quiet room near the shelter's office. Lauren set up a small recorder and offered Malin a bottle of water. Malin took it, her hands trembling slightly. She wasn't sure what she expected, that the act of telling her story would open a floodgate or break her apart, but in the end, it was less dramatic and more like exhaling after holding her breath for too long. She began slowly, her voice low at first. She spoke about Jason, how they had met, the early years, the ache of wanting a child. She recounted the tests, the hospital visits, the disappointment turned to cautious joy when she finally saw those 2 pink lines. She told Lauren how Jason had smiled when she told him, how for a moment it had felt like everything would be okay. And then she spoke of the day it ended, how he had looked out the window instead of at her, how he said the words with no emotion, no anger, just distance, how he told her to leave, how she had stood on the sidewalk with nowhere to go, carrying not just her belongings, but a child who had no idea the ground beneath them had disappeared. Lauren didn't interrupt. She only nodded, occasionally scribbling notes, her eyes never straying too far from Malin's face. When the story ended, there was silence. "Thank you," Lauren said softly. "You didn't have to share that, but I'm glad you did." Malin felt raw, but lighter. "What happens now?" "We'd like to invite you on air," Lauren said. "It's not live, we can pre-record, you'll have control. But I think people need to hear this. Not just to understand what's happening to people in this city, but to remember that it can happen to anyone. You've done everything right, and still..." She trailed off, her expression sad but determined. People need reminding. Malin hesitated, then nodded. Okay. The day of the recording, she was nervous. The station was small but professional, with glass-paneled offices and the low hum of editing software echoing down the halls. Lauren met her at the front and walked her through the setup, explaining how the interview would go and reassuring her that she could stop at any time. They sat in a recording booth with padded walls and microphones suspended like curious metal birds. A producer gave them a signal, and Lauren leaned in. "I'm here with Malin Evans," she began, "a woman whose story touched me deeply, and who has agreed to share part of it with us today." Malin inhaled. Then she spoke. The words came more easily this time. She spoke not just of what had happened, but how it felt. How the betrayal had sliced through her sense of safety. How the shelter had humbled her. How every day now was built on uncertainty. She didn't cry. Her voice was steady. She talked about what it meant to carry life inside you while your own life was crumbling. "I don't know how I'll raise this child," she admitted. "I don't know where we'll live, or how I'll work, or what the future looks like, but I want him to know that I tried, that I didn't give up, even when it felt like the world had given up on me." The interview ended with Lauren thanking her again and promising to keep in touch. Malin left the station feeling exposed but strangely proud. She had spoken. She had let herself be seen. Back at the shelter, Gladys was waiting in the hallway with her usual paper cup of instant coffee. She didn't ask how it went. She just handed Malin the cup and said, "Now we wait." Malin sipped the bitter coffee and nodded. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel invisible. Someone had heard her voice. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the beginning of something new. The morning the segment aired, the sky was clouded over with thick sheets of gray, the kind that dim the city to a perpetual twilight. At the shelter, the usual bustle continued. Volunteers passing out trays of instant oatmeal, women shuffling through the hallway in slippers and worn coats, children squabbling over plastic toys in the corner of the common room. But Malin sat in the small television lounge, one hand resting over the curve of her stomach, her gaze fixed on the old radio that crackled faintly in the corner. The voices hadn't reached her yet, but her heart was already thudding like a drum against her ribs. Lauren had called the night before to say the interview would air during the morning segment, sometime between 7 and 8. It would also be posted online afterward, but something about the idea of it going out live, traveling through invisible signals into cars, kitchens, and offices, made it feel more real, more immediate. Malin wasn't sure how many people would listen, or how they would respond. She only knew that she had spoken with honesty, and that in doing so, something inside her had shifted. At 10 minutes past 7, the announcer's voice came through the static, warm and practiced. "Good morning. This is Lauren Daniels with our weekly Human Interest feature. Today's story is about resilience, loss, and the strength to keep going when the world feels like it's closing in. I spoke with Malin Evans, a woman currently living in a local shelter. What she shared moved me deeply, and I think it will move you too." There was a pause, a gentle breath, and then Malin's voice filled the room. It was surreal to hear herself like that, steady, clear, somehow more composed than she remembered. Her words played back with a kind of gravity that filled the air around her. A few other women in the lounge looked up from their seats, their expressions shifting. One of them turned the volume up a notch. Malin listened as if she hadn't been the one to speak, absorbing the rhythm of her own voice as it wove through the details of her life. The sound of Lauren's quiet interjections, the soft piano music layered beneath the narration, made it feel intimate and expansive all at once. She heard herself speak of love, betrayal, and fear, not as weaknesses, but as truths. And when she said, "I don't know how I'll raise this child, but I know I want him to grow up knowing his mother didn't give up," she felt the silence in the room deepen. Not heavy, just full. When the segment ended, the radio faded to the usual programming. Music played, conversations resumed. But Malin remained still, her hand clenched slightly around the armrest of her chair. Across the room, a woman in a purple hoodie gave her a small nod. Another, cradling a toddler on her lap, mouthed the word, "Thank you." Malin met their eyes and offered a quiet smile, her throat tight. Later that afternoon, Lauren called again. "The phones haven't stopped ringing," she said, breathless with excitement. "I mean, we always get some response to these stories, but this... Malin, people are really responding. They want to know how to help." Malin pressed her back against the cold wall of the shelter's hallway, the phone warm against her ear. "Help?" she echoed, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Yes, donations, letters." One woman called in tears and asked if she could knit baby blankets. A retired teacher wants to set up a GoFundMe. We've already received 3 boxes of maternity clothes. Malin closed her eyes, overwhelmed. She had expected sympathy, maybe a few kind words. She hadn't expected a wave. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything right now," Lauren replied. "Just be open, let it happen. People care." Over the next few days, the shelter became a kind of temporary post office. Packages began to arrive, some addressed simply to Malin, the woman on the radio. Inside were baby onesies, boxes of diapers, notes written in uneven cursive or typed in neat fonts. "You're not alone. We believe in you. Thank you for sharing your story." Some included phone numbers or email addresses, offers of childcare assistance, housing suggestions, job leads. It was more than Malin could process. She began to keep a box beneath her bed just for the letters, reading them late at night when the shelter was quiet and the world outside felt less hostile. Gladys, naturally, refused to make a fuss. "People love a story," she said, sipping her tea. "Don't mean they'll stick around when things get hard." But even she softened when a group of high school students delivered handmade cards to the shelter, each one covered in glitter, stars, and messages like, "You're strong and your baby is lucky to have you." One card featured a drawing of a house with smoke coming out of the chimney and a smiling woman holding a baby. Malin kept that one in her coat pocket. Then, one morning, Lauren returned to the shelter, her cheeks flushed with the cold, her smile quick and excited. "There's a local coffee shop owner who heard your story," she said. "He called us this morning. He's offering you part-time work and temporary housing. He has a room above the cafe. He said it's nothing fancy, but it's warm and private. He even wants to help you set up a payment plan for prenatal care if you don't have coverage." Malin stared at her, unable to speak. "He wants to meet you," Lauren added gently. "No pressure, but I think it could be a real step." It took Malin several hours to decide, not because she was unwilling, but because hope had become something foreign. After so many weeks of bracing herself against disappointment, she didn't know how to trust the idea that something good might actually last. That evening, she met the cafe owner, James, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands. His coffee shop, nestled on a quiet corner near the river, smelled of cinnamon and espresso. The upstairs room was small but clean, with a bed, a dresser, a kitchenette, and a window that let in the morning light. Malin stood in the doorway, tears stinging her eyes. She could see herself here. She could imagine rocking her child to sleep in that very corner, the warmth of coffee drifting up through the floorboards. "I don't need much," she said quietly. "Just somewhere to feel safe." James nodded. "Then it's yours." Back at the shelter, she packed her bags for the second time in as many months, but this time not with fear. She hugged Gladys at the door, who grumbled but hugged her back, muttering something about cheap heat and noisy baristas. "Come visit," Malin said. Gladys waved a hand. "Just don't forget where you came from." As she walked out into the crisp afternoon light, her bags lighter than before, Malin felt something bloom in her chest. Not certainty, not yet, but the beginning of something close to it, the beginning of possibility. The next few days were a whirlwind. She settled into the new space, began working a few shifts at the cafe, wiping tables, learning the register, chatting shyly with regulars who looked at her with curiosity, and, once in a while, recognition. "Aren't you the woman from the radio?" someone asked, and she would nod, feeling both seen and strangely distant from the version of herself that had spoken into that microphone. Donations continued to arrive, some rerouted to the cafe by Lauren Station. James set aside a small corner near the counter for letters and gifts. Malin's Corner, the handwritten sign read. A chalkboard hung beside it with the words, "Kindness grows when shared." People began leaving notes there, too, short phrases, anonymous messages. "You've got this. One day at a time. We're rooting for you." Malin read them during her breaks, each one like a warm hand on her back. At night, in her small upstairs room, she would sit by the window with her tea and look out over the quiet street. She still didn't have a plan. The future was still a stretch of unknowns, but for the first time in a long time she wasn't bracing for the worst. She was leaning gently toward the light, and in the silence of that room, with her baby shifting gently beneath her skin, and the soft sounds of laughter rising from the cafe below, Malin whispered a quiet promise to the child she hadn't yet met. "We're going to be okay," she said, and this time she believed it. The room above the cafe, modest though it was, soon began to feel like a refuge. It wasn't the soft bed or the small kitchenette that made it special, nor the wide window that let the morning light spill across the floor in golden squares. It was the simple, undeniable fact that it was hers. Not borrowed from a cold-hearted husband, not shared with strangers behind numbered doors, not subject to the whim of any system. It was the first space in weeks, months, really, where Malin could breathe without flinching. Her first night there had been quiet, the kind of silence that stretched rather than oppressed. She had unpacked slowly, placing folded clothes in the dresser, propping her well-worn copy of the Velveteen Rabbit on the windowsill, and stacking the baby things she'd received into neat piles by the wall. She hadn't yet prepared the room as a nursery, but she began to imagine it. A small cradle in the corner, a basket of tiny socks by the bed, perhaps a string of lights above the window. Not grand things, but gentle ones. She could almost hear the hush of lullabies and the soft breaths of a sleeping child. Downstairs, the cafe had a warmth that went beyond its coffee. It was something in the way James greeted every customer like an old friend, how the regulars knew each other's orders, how laughter occasionally drifted from table to table like the scent of cinnamon rolls. Malin started out cautiously, wiping down tables and refilling sugar containers, keeping mostly to herself. But soon, customers began to notice her. A few recognized her from the radio. Others simply saw her growing belly and offered a smile or a gentle word. "You're the brave one," one woman said softly, placing a hand briefly over Malin's. "I heard your story. You remind me of my sister. She raised her son on her own. He's a teacher now." Another day, a college student left a sticky note folded under a muffin wrapper. It read, "Your voice stayed with me. Thank you for not staying silent." The notes didn't stop. Neither did the donations. Lauren, true to her word, stayed involved. She stopped by the cafe once a week with updates. The station had decided to keep a short segment running on Malin's progress, not as an exploitation, but as a kind of live-in follow-up, a way to show listeners that their empathy wasn't in vain. That change, when guided by compassion, could take root. One afternoon, James wheeled in 2 large boxes left by a delivery driver. Malin opened them carefully, revealing stacks of diapers, formula, baby shampoo, and a brand new baby carrier. Tucked among the items was a card with a photograph of a smiling couple and the words, "We struggled to conceive for years. When we heard your story, we felt it in our bones. If we had a daughter, we would name her after you. We hope this helps, even a little." Malin sat on the floor surrounded by the gifts, the card resting in her lap. She felt the weight of it all, not the boxes, but the kindness. It was heavy in the best way. She pressed her palm to her stomach. "See?" she whispered. "There are good people. We're not alone." James decided to dedicate a corner of the cafe to the donations. He cleared a small wooden shelf by the counter and placed a hand-painted sign above it. "Community Cradle. Helping Malin and Baby E." Customers began to bring small items, knitted hats, gift cards, baby books with notes scribbled inside. One customer left a silver rattle with an inscription, "To New Beginnings." Even the customers who brought nothing tangible offered her something else, connection. They asked how she was feeling, how far along she was, if she had picked a name. Some shared their own stories of motherhood, of hardship, of starting over. In those conversations, Malin began to see that suffering wasn't an anomaly. It was a thread that wound through more lives than she'd ever imagined, binding strangers together in invisible ways. The work at the cafe became more than just a job. It was therapy. As she swept floors and brewed pots of coffee, as she listened to the background hum of conversation and the clink of mugs, she felt her own pieces slowly coming back together. There was something healing in movement, in having a purpose, in being needed. She began to take pride in the way the napkins were folded, the freshness of the pastries, the warmth of her smile when a customer walked through the door. James, ever quiet and observant, noticed the change. One evening, after closing, he handed her a sealed envelope. "I had a few customers ask if you had a fund set up," he said. "I told them I'd hold on to anything until you were ready." Inside the envelope was a thick wad of bills, along with several checks. One note read, "For the nursery. You'll know what it needs." Another simply said, "Because no mother should face the world alone." Malin's throat closed as she looked at the contents. I don't know if I can accept all this." James gave her a gentle look. "You already have. The moment you told your story, you gave people the chance to show up. Don't rob them of that." That night, she counted the money carefully and stored it in a lockbox James let her keep in the office. She made a spreadsheet, labeled the envelopes, tracked every dollar. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building something lasting. She began visiting thrift stores on her days off, carefully selecting baby clothes, bottles, and blankets. She found a second-hand bassinet with a mobile of tiny stars and a soft glider chair that creaked but still rocked. She washed each item by hand in the small kitchen sink upstairs, humming as she worked. The room began to transform. It no longer felt like temporary shelter. It felt like a beginning. And with that transformation came something deeper. Peace. Not constant, not unshakable, but present. It found her in the stillness of early mornings when the sun rose just over the neighboring rooftops. It touched her in the laughter of a child at the cafe and the brief squeeze of a hand from a customer who had once been a stranger. It settled into her bones the night she stood in the middle of the room looking around at all the small pieces she had gathered and realized she had made a home. It was during one of these quiet nights that she decided to write a letter back to the shelter. She addressed it to the women she had met, the ones she had shared that tight, dim room with, and most of all to Gladys. She wrote about the cafe, the donations, the kindness of strangers, the nursery in progress. She wrote not to boast or even to encourage, but to say thank you for the sandwich, for the scarf advice, for the nudge that had started everything. A week later, she received a reply. The letter was short, written in shaky penmanship on lined paper. Saw you on the news. You look different, in a good way. Come visit sometime. Bring cookies. G. Malin laughed when she read it, the sound full and round in the room. By the end of the month, Malin had more than she ever expected. A job she enjoyed, a room she had made her own, a community that continued to surprise her. There were still moments of doubt, flickers of fear about what lay beyond childbirth, about single motherhood, about raising a child in a world that didn't always feel safe or fair. But those fears no longer lived in the center of her chest. They lingered on the edges, present but no longer in control. One evening, James sat down across from her during closing, his hands wrapped around a mug of decaf. "You've got something special, you know," he said quietly. "Not just your story, the way you carry it, with dignity." Malin looked at him, unsure how to respond. "I see a lot of people come through here. Most of them are looking for a place to land. But you're building." She smiled, her hand resting over the gentle swell of her belly. "I'm trying." He nodded. "That's all any of us can do." And as the cafe lights dimmed and the street outside darkened into quiet shadows, Malin stood at the threshold of the stairs leading back to her room. Behind her, the cafe was clean and ready for morning. Before her, the soft glow of her little home waited. The first wave of help had not only kept her afloat, it had carried her to shore. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, she had found her footing, one small step at a time. The days had begun to stretch a little longer, not just in hours, but in warmth. Spring approached quietly, wrapping the city in a gentler light. The snow that had once lined the sidewalks had melted into dark puddles, and the trees, still bare, trembled as if preparing to bloom. From her window above the cafe, Malin watched the seasons shift like the pages of a slow, careful book, and felt something shift inside her, too. Her belly had grown considerably. What was once a quiet presence beneath her clothes had become an unmistakable weight, round and firm, a declaration. She moved more slowly now, her steps measured, her breath shallower on stairs, but there was a grace to her slowness, a rhythm. The baby kicked often, sometimes with startling force, other times with soft pulses that felt like whispers. She had learned to distinguish a stretch from a nudge, a hiccup from a flutter. Sometimes she would rest both hands over the curve of her stomach and murmur things only the two of them could understand. These were her favorite moments, still wordless, sacred. At the cafe, she had become part of the fabric, not just an employee, but a presence. Customers greeted her by name now. Some brought little gifts unprompted, an extra muffin, a pair of mittens for the baby, a book of bedtime stories. One elderly woman handed her a small jar of homemade jam with a ribbon around the lid. "For the mornings you feel tired," she said with a wink, "and trust me, there will be many." James, ever the quiet anchor, had eased her into more responsibility. She learned how to manage the register, handle deliveries, and even experimented with baking under his watchful eye. Her confidence grew, not in leaps, but in steady steps. She began to look forward to the routine. The early hours, the smell of warm pastries, the low murmur of conversation that filled the cafe like background music. But even as comfort settled around her like a favorite blanket, Malin knew not to let it lull her into complacency. The baby was coming, and with him 1,000 new realities. She kept a notebook beside her bed where she scribbled lists at night, pediatricians to research, government assistance programs to apply for, legal aid to explore. She read parenting books borrowed from the library, attended free prenatal classes at the community center, and kept every appointment with her new doctor, whose clinic had welcomed her with quiet compassion after hearing her story. It was during one of these checkups that Malin found herself sitting alone in the waiting room, watching a mother with twin toddlers try to keep them entertained with stickers and snacks. The children's laughter echoed through the room like chimes, chaotic but joyful. Malin smiled, then glanced down at her stomach. The baby shifted, as if responding to the sound. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her body was tired, but her mind ran ahead of her, looping through what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. She thought about diapers and midnight feedings, about fevers and first steps. She thought about Jason, whether he ever wondered about her, about the baby, if he ever listened to the radio. She doubted it. But sometimes she let herself imagine he had. That maybe he had heard her voice and realized what he had walked away from. She didn't wish him pain. Not anymore. Only distance. She sat by the window, the cool glass pressing against her palm, and let the moonlight soothe her. The city below was quiet. She could see the dark outline of the trees in the park and a few flickering windows in the apartment building across the street. Somewhere down below, someone was walking a dog. A taxi rolled past, headlights soft in the mist. It all felt suspended, like a breath held just before dawn. The next morning, she woke early and decided to write. It started with a letter to her unborn son. She didn't plan it. She simply opened her notebook and began. She told him about the snow the day she had been left behind, about the woman in the shelter who taught her how to guard her shoes, about the cafe and the people who had wrapped her in warmth when she thought she would never stop shivering. She wrote of hope, not the glittering kind found in stories, but the quiet kind, built one kind gesture at a time. After that, she began writing every night. Sometimes to the baby, sometimes to herself. She wrote about her fears, her anger, her joy. She wrote about the first time she had felt him kick and the way it had made her cry. She wrote about the weight of standing in line for food with strangers and the healing that came from washing a donated blanket with her own hands. Her words poured out, not to be shared, but to be remembered. She wanted to remember every moment, not because it was all beautiful, but because it was real. One day, James found her at the corner table before her shift, reading from her notebook. He sat across from her, sipping his coffee. "You write a lot," he said. She nodded. "It helps." He glanced at the cover. "You ever think about sharing it?" Malin closed the book gently. "I shared once. On the radio, that was enough. James tilted his head. Maybe, but sometimes stories don't end. They just grow. She didn't respond, but the words stayed with her. That weekend, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a quilt, handmade with tiny animals stitched into the fabric. Folded inside was a letter written in sloping handwriting. I was where you are once. 20 years ago. Different city, different man, same fear. I raised my daughter alone. It was hard, it was messy, but it was worth it. This quilt is hers. She's in college now. She said to give it to someone who might need it. I think she meant you. Malin ran her fingers over the fabric, tears stinging her eyes. She placed the quilt on the glider chair and sat beside it, holding her belly. See, she whispered. Someone made it through. So can we. Her room above the cafe had begun to bloom with life. The bassinet stood ready. A small dresser held neatly folded clothes, sorted by size and season. There were stacks of books, a mobile of stars that tinkled gently when the window was open, and a shelf of tiny shoes. Every item had a story, a stranger's generosity, a quiet act of care, a reminder that she was not forgotten. Sometimes she wondered what the baby would be like. Would he have her eyes? Jason's smile? Would he love music, or books, or the sound of rain? Would he ask about his father one day? She didn't have answers, but she knew this. He would be loved, fiercely, endlessly, without condition. At the cafe, spring arrived in earnest. The windows were open more often. People lingered at tables talking about gardens and graduations. Malin moved more slowly now, resting more often, her shift shortened by James's insistence. You've done enough, he told her. Time to put your feet up. She agreed reluctantly, but she kept coming in, helping where she could, greeting regulars, sitting by the counter with her notebook. One afternoon, a young woman approached her with a hesitant smile. Are you Malin? She nodded. The woman's eyes welled with tears. I was in a shelter last year, heard your interview. It helped me leave someone, helped me believe I could be okay. Malin stood slowly and hugged her. No words were needed. Later, she sat alone in the quiet cafe and opened her notebook again. Maybe James was right. Maybe some stories don't end. Maybe they ripple. That night, as she lay in bed, the baby shifted low and heavy, and a dull ache settled in her back. She knew the signs. Not yet, but close. Very close. She placed her hands on her stomach, breathed in the scent of lavender from the candle on her dresser, and whispered, We're almost there. The path behind her was long and crooked, lined with sorrow and strength. The one ahead was still unseen, but she wasn't afraid of it anymore. The first pang came in the early morning, faint but unmistakable. Malin woke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the window and the lingering chill of spring air curling through the cracks in the frame. She lay still for a moment, listening. The city had not yet stirred. The cafe below was silent. The ache in her lower back pulsed gently, then receded. She pressed her palm to her stomach and waited, breathing slowly, counting seconds. The baby shifted but didn't protest. She wasn't sure if it was time, but something had changed. She sat up, groaning softly, and shuffled into the small kitchen where she heated water for tea and pulled on a warm sweater. She moved with the care of someone who had grown used to monitoring every signal from her body. The baby was full of life lately, his kicks less frantic, more deliberate, as if he too were preparing. She felt him stretch against her ribs as she sipped from her chipped mug and looked out the window. The view hadn't changed much, same stretch of brick buildings, Same lamppost flickering as the morning light gained strength. But Malin saw it all differently now. It felt familiar, claimed. Her room no longer felt like borrowed space. It was a beginning that she had earned. She moved more slowly these days, and not just because of her size. She had grown cautious with her hope. She protected it, nurtured it. But this morning, as the ache returned, sharper this time, she allowed herself to admit it. She was ready for what came next. Downstairs, the cafe stirred to life. James arrived before opening, carrying 2 bags of flour and humming under his breath. When he saw her, he paused, wiping his hands on his apron. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he took in her pale face. She hesitated. "I think it's starting. Maybe. I'm not sure yet." He nodded, calm as ever. "You want me to drive you to the hospital?" "Not yet," she said. "I just wanted to be around people for a bit, just in case." He didn't argue. He cleared a stool behind the counter and brought her a small plate of toast and fruit. "You sit. We'll keep an eye on things." The morning passed in a blur of faces and voices, the usual comfort of the cafe humming around her. Customers came and went. Some left notes. One woman brought a hand-sewn blanket, placing it gently on the donation shelf with a soft smile. Another left a bag of groceries with a note that read, "For when the baby comes, you've got this." By midday, Lauren appeared, cheeks flushed from the wind, a messenger bag slung over her shoulder. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, though Malin suspected she had come specifically. "I brought something." From her bag, she pulled out a manila envelope. "There's a local foundation, Hopewell Family Fund. They support single mothers starting over. We ran a follow-up story last week. They want to help." Malin opened the envelope slowly, her breath catching as she pulled out the papers inside. There were letters of confirmation, gift certificates, and a signed agreement. Financial support for prenatal and postnatal care, child care assistance for the first year, and a housing grant for transitioning to a long-term rental. And, at the very bottom, a handwritten letter from the director of the foundation. "Your story reminded me of my mother. She raised me alone. She never asked for help, but she needed it. I wish someone had stepped in for her sooner. This is our way of doing that now. For her, for you." Malin read the letter twice, then placed it carefully back into the envelope, her hands shaking. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Lauren smiled. "You don't have to say anything. You already said enough." It was late afternoon when the phone rang. James answered, spoke for a moment, then passed it to Malin. "It's for you." She took the receiver, surprised. "Hello?" A warm voice greeted her. "Miss Evans, my name is Sarah Holloway. I'm a volunteer coordinator at the First Street Community Center. We've been following your story, and we're wondering if you'd be open to receiving some in-person support. We've partnered with several local groups who've expressed interest in helping prepare your space for the baby, if that's something you'd be comfortable with." Malin blinked, stunned. I don't know, yes, of course, but we understand it's a lot," Sarah continued, "but you've inspired a lot of people. Let us do this for you." The next day, volunteers began arriving. They came with paint, tools, boxes, and boundless energy. Some were teenagers from the local high school, others retirees, a few young mothers with babies of their own strapped to their chests. They cleaned and organized, set up shelves and storage bins, hung curtains, and added soft lighting. They transformed the simple upstairs room into a soft, inviting haven. Someone brought a crib, freshly painted white, with hand-carved stars along the sides. Another set up a diaper changing station stocked with everything from wipes to creams. a team of artists painted a mural along the wall behind the crib, a soft landscape of hills and sky, with a single tree at the center, its branches reaching toward the ceiling. Malin watched it all unfold with tears in her eyes. She tried to help, but the volunteers insisted she rest. They moved around her like a dance, efficient and full of joy. Every so often, someone would pause to ask about her due date, her plans, her feelings. She answered with a heart full of gratitude. That evening, after everyone had gone and the room glowed with the soft light of fairy lights strung along the ceiling, James handed her a small box. "It came for you," he said. "No return address." Inside was a small velvet pouch. She opened it slowly to reveal a necklace, simple, silver, with a delicate charm shaped like a key. Attached was a note on ivory paper, "For the door you opened, for the life you stepped into. May you always know that you are the key to more than you realize." Malin held the necklace to her chest and let the tears fall freely. 3 days later, she went into labor. It started in the early hours, more insistent this time. No mistaking it. She woke James and he helped her into the car, driving carefully through the quiet streets. At the hospital, nurses moved quickly, guiding her through intake, easing her into a room. The hours passed in waves: pain, breath, rest, repeat. Lauren came and held her hand. A volunteer from the community center arrived with a bag of snacks and encouragement. James checked in every few hours, and finally, after a long, aching silence and a sudden flood of sound and motion, a cry filled the room. It was sharp and strong, a declaration. Malin looked down at her son, swaddled and blinking, his face red and scrunched, his body small and impossibly perfect. She held him to her chest, feeling the thud of his heart against hers, and breathed in the scent of him. New, real, hers. The nurse asked if she had a name. She nodded. Elijah. The nurse smiled and wrote it on the bassinet card. Later, when the room had quieted, when Elijah slept nestled against her, Malin looked out the hospital window at the night sky. She thought about the shelter, about Gladys and the room with the creaky beds, about the radio station and the first time she heard her own voice broadcast to strangers, about the cafe and James's calm presence, about Lauren's unwavering support, about the volunteers who had given her a home, about the letters and the quilt and the necklace and the foundation's gift. Every moment had led here, a gift from fate. That's what it felt like. Not luck, not charity, a gift, earned not by virtue or perfection, but by surviving, by showing up, by daring to believe. She pressed her lips to Elijah's forehead. "We're okay," she whispered. "We're more than okay." And in that quiet hospital room, with the world outside still spinning, Malin understood what had changed. She wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. She had already saved herself. The morning after her discharge, the sky was bright with the first clear sunlight of early summer. The city stirred around her like something wakened gently from sleep. Cars moved more slowly. Pedestrians stopped to speak in front of shop windows, and the breeze smelled faintly of blossoms. Malin sat in the passenger seat of James's old sedan, cradling Elijah in her arms, her body still tender from the ordeal of birth, her heart full in ways she hadn't yet learned how to name. The infant slept soundly, bundled in the quilt passed down by a stranger, his small fingers curled into the air like a promise. James drove with exaggerated care, glancing over every few minutes to make sure she was still all right. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. When they reached the cafe, He pulled up close to the curb, and for a moment, they simply sat there in the sunlight. "Ready?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Malin looked down at her son, then up at the small building that had become her sanctuary. The sign in the window read "Open" in cheerful script, and through the glass she could already see Lauren waiting, holding a box wrapped in brown paper. A few others were gathered too, neighbors, customers, volunteers. She nodded. "I think I've never been more ready." They helped her upstairs slowly, with Elijah still asleep in her arms, undisturbed by the shift in scenery. When she opened the door to her room, she gasped. It wasn't just the same safe space she had left behind. It had been transformed again, this time not by hands, but by hearts. A small welcome banner hung above the crib, and a mobile of hand-folded paper cranes danced gently in the breeze from the open window. On the table was a bouquet of daisies and white tulips, her favorite flowers, and beside it, a stack of cards tied with ribbon. A note was propped up next to a tin of oatmeal cookies. "From all of us who walked with you, even for just a moment." She stood in the doorway, unable to move. Then Lauren stepped forward and wrapped her in a careful hug. "You did it," she said into her ear. "You really did it." Malin laughed, though her eyes brimmed with tears. "I don't think I did it alone." The following days passed in a blur of exhaustion and awe. New motherhood arrived like a tide, relentless, tender, full of moments that blurred together and others that etched themselves permanently into memory. She learned Elijah's cries by tone and timing. She discovered the comfort of skin-to-skin contact, of whispered lullabies in the blue hours of morning. Her body ached in new places, her sleep was interrupted in rhythms that made no sense, but through it all, a deeper calm settled over her, as if some ancient instinct had risen to meet this new chapter. She wasn't without help. Lauren came by often, sometimes just to sit with her and hold the baby while Malin showered or napped. Volunteers from the center delivered meals and helped with errands. The staff at the clinic continued to check in, ensuring her recovery went smoothly. James, though always busy downstairs, made sure she never lacked for warm food or quiet encouragement. The community that had lifted her up in her darkest moments did not vanish when the spotlight faded. They stayed. That, more than anything, surprised her. Elijah grew quickly. His face changed almost daily, from squashed and sleepy to curious and expressive. He had a habit of staring at light, as if deciphering it, and Malin often found herself sitting beside him by the window, narrating the world outside. "That's a bus," she'd whisper. "That's a dog barking. That's a couple arguing about directions." She didn't know if it mattered, but she believed that a child who hears love in every tone will learn to speak it too. A month passed, then another. Summer unfolded like a new breath. Malin began taking Elijah downstairs with her in the mornings, where he became the unofficial mascot of the cafe. Customers cooed over him. Some brought toys, others just came to check in. James added a high chair in the back corner, even though it would be months before Elijah could use it. "Planning ahead," he said with a shrug. The space that had once been her refuge now became her foundation. Malin began writing again, this time more intentionally. She took the notebooks she had filled during pregnancy and began shaping them into essays. At first, she wrote only for herself, but Lauren, ever attuned, saw the spark and nudged her gently. "You should share them," she said. "People need stories like yours." Malin hesitated. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to be trapped forever as the woman from the radio. But the idea grew inside her like a seed. Maybe this was a way to honor everything that had happened, to make it count for more than survival. She submitted one essay anonymously to a local parenting blog. It was published within the week. The responses were immediate. Mothers, fathers, grandparents writing in to say they saw themselves in her words, that her story made them feel less alone. She kept writing. One quiet afternoon, while Elijah napped in his crib and the scent of warm pastries drifted up through the floorboards, she received an email from a small publisher. One of the blog editors had passed along her writing. They wanted to talk about a collection, about her voice, about turning pain into something lasting. She stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Then she wrote, "Yes, I'd love to talk." Later that day, she walked to the shelter. She had meant to go for weeks but hadn't found the courage. Now, with Elijah strapped to her chest and her steps steady, she walked the familiar route. The building looked the same, gray and hunched as if bearing the weight of too many stories. Inside, the fluorescent lights still buzzed. The same staff members sat behind the front desk. When she asked for Gladys, the woman raised her eyebrows. "She's still here. Room 12. Malin made her way down the hallway, her heart pounding. The door to room 12 was slightly ajar. She knocked. Gladys sat on the bed, folding laundry. She looked up, saw her, and grunted. "Took you long enough?" Malin laughed. "I brought cookies." Gladys took the bag, glanced at the baby. "So that's him." "Elijah," Malin said. Gladys reached out and touched the baby's cheek with surprising gentleness. "Looks like a fighter." "He is." They sat together for an hour. Malin told her about the birth, the nursery, the volunteers, the writing. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. "You were right," she said finally. "Telling the story, it saved me." Gladys nodded slowly. "Good. Just don't forget the rest, the quiet parts, the waiting." "I won't." When she left, Gladys handed her a small piece of paper. "A woman came through last week," she said. "Situation like yours. Pregnant, scared, smart. Maybe you could talk to her." Malin took the paper and tucked it into her coat. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows on the sidewalk. Elijah stirred in his carrier, his eyes opening slowly, blinking against the light. Malin bent her head and kissed his forehead. "We'll go home soon," she murmured. "Just one more stop." She returned to the cafe just as James was locking up. He smiled at the sight of her and the baby, stepping aside to let them in. Upstairs, everything was still. The dishes washed, the laundry folded, the crib bathed in the last light of day. Malin sat down by the window with Elijah in her arms. She looked out at the street, at the city that had tested and held her, at the sky that had watched her fall and rise. She had come through it, not untouched, not unchanged, but whole. She whispered to her son as his eyes drifted closed again. "You came into my life when everything fell apart, and you made it new." Outside, the wind stirred the leaves. Inside, the room was warm and full of quiet. A new life had begun, and this time it belonged fully to her. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to see where the journey leads, and feel free to share this one with someone who needs a little hope today.